we're lucky that nothing ever went wrong. In fact, the law of odds is working against us. And the longer we sort of stay here, assuming nothing will ever go wrong, the more likely it is that something will go wrong.
That's the voice of Alexandra Bell of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. Can I please sing that song from Welcome Back, Carter? Okay, welcome back to the 46th episode of Press the Button. We're approaching 1 year of our podcast with no breaks, no weeks off. We're going to celebrate in some fashion when we hit 52, but we're going to celebrate with a wonderful month of special podcasts beginning next week with Jessica Matthews coming in, my former boss, the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she's going to be talking about the Pentagon budget. But first,
this week in Early Warning, we'll be looking at where the 2020 Democratic candidates stand on nuclear policy issues. We'll have a firsthand account of ICANN's 2020 Paris Forum and the latest on Iran's parliamentary elections.
And we'll be skipping the question and answer session this week in favor of an extended interview with Alexandra Bell. She's the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. I've worked closely with Alex for a long time. She was my first employee here when we opened up the Plowshares Fund office over 12 years ago. She's one of the brightest minds in the field. You'll listen to us talk about China, about Russia, and about arms control, nuclear spending, and the Pentagon budget, and much, much more, including how she made it in the field and how she got to be in the leadership role she is. This is an interview I think you're really going to enjoy.
We always ask that you give us a rating or a review if you find us interesting, but I have one additional request this week. If you like us, please share us with a friend. We know that they ask for your recommendations, and your plug is what helps us reach new listeners. And if you have a question you'd like to submit, please reach out to us on Twitter at any time. We're at PressButtonPod.
And if you're in the Palo Alto area, on March 3rd, I'll be giving a lecture at Stanford University at 3:30 in the afternoon on the tragedy of American nuclear policy. You can find the details up at the Plowshares Fund website, plowshares.org. But we've got a lot to talk about today, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today I'm joined by Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund, and Catherine Killough, Advocacy and Leadership Coordinator at Women Cross DMZ.
And former Hale Fellow at the Plowshares Fund.
That's right. The Hale Fellows unite. Are you both ready to cover the nuclear news in 7 minutes?
Absolutely.
Our time starts now. Akshay, we are in the midst of the Democratic primaries. Super Tuesday is next week. We have debate after debate. We're hearing a lot about and from various Democratic candidates, but we didn't hear much in the last debate about foreign policy. Where do these candidates stand on nuclear policy issues?
So that's right, Michelle. After debate, the last debate did not discuss foreign policy pretty much at all. However, the candidates have been pressed on their record on nuclear issues, and we have seen both some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that there is some deviance from the Democratic Party consensus, specifically on the issue of no first use. So frequent listeners of the podcast will recall that a no first use policy by the United States would guarantee that we would never start a nuclear war, that we would never use nuclear weapons first. And there is a consensus in the Democratic Party around this. Elizabeth Warren has a bill in favor of the idea. Bernie Sanders supports it. Joe Biden supports it. The House Armed Services Chair Adam Smith supports it. And former cabinet secretaries like Bill Perry support this. However, last week or the week before, Amy Klobuchar came out against this idea. Pete Buttigieg has kind of been difficult to pin down on some of these issues, but he's expressed some reluctance on this issue as well. And their concerns revolve around two main points. Klobuchar said that we would need to use nuclear weapons to respond to a biological attack, potentially, which I think is out of line with American interests and American values, that we would use nuclear weapons to respond to a non-nuclear attack. And then Pete Buttigieg said that if we have this promise that we would not use nuclear weapons first, some of our allies might panic and think that they would have to get their own nuclear weapons. But a no first use policy would assure that the United States would respond to an attack on itself or its allies. So it seems like his concerns are misguided.
What about the other nuclear policy issues, whether it's the Iran deal or extending New START?
Sure. So the good news is on a lot of nuclear issues, there is consistent support for arms control and non-proliferation in the Democratic Party. Pretty much all the Democratic candidates support the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama negotiated. Pretty much all of them support extending the New START agreement with Russia. The big question mark over nuclear issues and the whole debate is Michael Bloomberg. I think we're going to find out more in the next few weeks what he thinks about nuclear weapons issues, and he's certainly going to be a factor in the weeks ahead.
Great. Catherine, you spoke at the ICANN Paris Forum recently, a conference that brought together activists and policymakers to discuss movement building and political change. What impact do you think the treaty is having been at this really sounds like an incredible conference?
Yeah, well, first, let me just give a huge shout out to the ICANN organizers and volunteers because it was a massive effort. I mean, there were more than 300 students, activists, artists there. And I think just on the question of impact, seeing the scale of support from across the world, how many diverse movements came together in support of the nuclear ban treaty was really striking to me. Not only that, but France, as you know, is not sympathetic to the nuclear ban treaty, but the mayor of Paris is actually very supportive, and so she is the reason why they were able to hold this forum in this amazing space for free. And so I think that also speaks to the power of ICANN, is that even when things at the very top political level seem so challenging, they're able to push through that and show that there is a groundswell of support from the grassroots level.
And when you say diverse movements, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think more than this conference being a convening of people who want to see the world rid of nuclear weapons, it was really a coming together of people who were in recognition of the joint struggle that they're all working towards. And you saw this reflected in the very thoughtful lineup of speakers. So to give an example, the conference actually opened with this incredible dialogue between the Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow and Indigenous organizer Leanna Morgan. And they talked about the legacy of nuclear colonialism on their land, on their cities, on their people, and how they are directly impacted by U.S. nuclear weapons making in the past and today. So that was just one example of the kind of incredible, intersectional vision of the conference that I was really honored to be a part of.
And when it comes to the treaty, what are the prospects for ratification and entry into force?
So right now, I believe they have 35 ratifications, and they're hoping to get 50, possibly before the end of this year, at which point the treaty could enter into force. So the prospects are looking good.
We'll keep an eye on it. Akshai, last week Iran held its parliamentary elections, which saw the lowest voter turnout in decades. While it appears that Iran's hardliners made significant gains, there was also not much choice on the ballot since more than 7,000 potential candidates have been disqualified. What does this mean for U.S.-Iran relations?
Right. So this has been a very interesting election in Iran because, as you said, it has the lowest voter turnout since the 1979 revolution. Partially, that's because the regime disqualified a lot of the more moderate candidates, leading to a boycott of the election. But it also was because of some coronavirus scares in some parts of Iran. The result is that the new parliament is very much controlled by hardliners. And I think that is going to be particularly important as Iran deals with nuclear diplomacy with the United States. The parliament has the ability to influence international agreements. The Wall Street Journal has said that they could hamper efforts to save the Iran nuclear deal or the JCPOA. And it could be an added pressure on the regime to exit the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran has threatened to do over U.S. sanctions, but has not done yet. And I think it just shows that the maximum pressure campaign does not seem to be working. The White House said that the point of that campaign was to drive Iran back to the negotiating table for a new nuclear deal. That seems even less likely with the results of this election. And an Iranian general told the Financial Times today that Iran will continue its missile and proxy program and won't even speak to Washington, which is the exact opposite outcome of what Trump and Pompeo said would happen when they pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in May 2018.
And that sound means that our time is up. Akshai, Catherine, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle.
You.
I'm sitting here with Alexandra Bell, who is the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, a sister organization of the Council for a Livable World. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about the current policies on nuclear weapons issues that you're dealing with, the politics around those issues and the role that the center plays in these political struggles. And then, if you don't mind, about your career path, how you ended up dealing with some of the most difficult issues human beings have to face. But let me start with an observation you have in your new article for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, what the presidential candidates should be asked about arms control and non-proliferation. I hadn't thought about this, but you highlight it. President Trump, you say, is on track to be the only president since Kennedy who has neither started nor completed a formal arms control negotiation in his first 4 years. Wow. Why does that matter?
Well, generally, considering the number of nuclear threats we're facing in the world, an administration that's batting zero on reducing those risks is a bit problematic. And the U.S. and the Russian Federation still control 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Continuing to draw those numbers down is a process that's not only good for the United States and Russia, but for the world in general. Every one of those nuclear weapons represents a potential threat to humankind.
Yeah. Give me your overall assessment of where we are. We're in Washington, and the Capitol Weather Gang has a daily forecast, and they say that they somewhat subjectively rate the day on a scale from 0 to 10. Today, for example, is a 4. It's kind of cold, it's kind of cloudy. Where are we on nuclear policy on a scale of 0 to 10?
10 being a world without nuclear weapons?
Yes. Okay, good.
I'd say we're at a 3.
Ooh.
And
Grim. And
yeah,
why?
it's
So why?
grim. And
What were your instant calculations there?
So even would be, I guess, that we're maintaining the agreements that we have, that there's no sort of proliferant threats going on, but we're not really making progress towards zero. I would say that anything under that is sort of a regression towards a world in which we are at risk of nuclear stockpiles going up. And in fact, the next president will have to, whether it's President Trump in his second term or a new president, will have to decide, is the United States going to choose to live in a world where the number of nuclear weapons is going up or going down? Mm-hmm. And I would say right now, today, it looks like a world in which the numbers are going to go up simply because of the policies that this country and other countries are taking, and the fact that the U.S. has historically been a leader in trying to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, at least in modern times, in our national security strategy. And this administration has gone in the opposite direction.
Yes, I think every time we've made progress on arms control, it's been because of U.S. leadership. Do you think that's true in the history of the nuclear age?
I heard, I think it was an Indian scholar once said the best thing about the U.S.-Russian strategic stability relationship is that the Americans never take no for an answer. And I think we're now seeing what happens when the U.S. just says, no or shrug.
Right, like the INF Treaty. You're cheating on the INF Treaty. We want you to stop. And the Russians say no, and we walk away.
Yeah, unfortunately, President Trump had the opportunity, because of this different relationship he has with President Putin, to maybe make some progress that the previous administration couldn't make in resolving the INF crisis. But instead, he took the counsel of John Bolton and others and decided to abandon a Reagan legacy treaty on the sidelines of a political rally in Elko, Nevada. Probably not what Reagan had in mind when he signed that treaty.
Let me drill down on this just a little bit, if you don't mind. And you were in the State Department. What was your position in the last few years?
I was a senior advisor at the State Department, working for the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security.
Which was Rose Gottemiller.
Rose Gottemiller.
And then Tom Countryman.
Tom Countryman, when Rose went to NATO, the highest ranking woman at NATO ever.
Where she became the
Deputy Secretary General of NATO. And Tom Countryman came in and was the acting Undersecretary.
And so this is when we discovered the intelligence about the Russians cheating on the INF treaty. This was under your term.
Oh, yes, in the Obama administration.
Yeah.
I can remember the moment that I found out, and I think I actually put my head down on the conference table because I was so frustrated, thought we had a path ahead following the ratification of New START and, could move to the next steps with Russia, start to get our arms around things like tactical nuclear weapons. So, yeah, I remember everything about that moment. I found out about the INF violation and try, as the Obama administration did, to try to get the Russians back into compliance. They couldn't find a way. But because the Trump administration had this very different relationship, because they had a relatively good plan in December 2017 that they rolled out on how they were going to deal with the Russian violation and efforts to get them back into compliance. But the problem is they never actually implemented it. Ambassador Bolton became the national security advisor a few months later. And, in less than a year, the president was announcing we were going to get out of the treaty.
And so this we're going to be like a Reagan-like approach. Remember, Ronald Reagan found that the Russians, then the Soviets, were in violation of the ABM treaty, and he worked for 6 years to get them back into compliance. In fact, this is when he negotiated the INF treaty. While he was still accusing the Russians of being in violation of one treaty, he went and negotiated a brand new treaty, and it worked. By the time Gorbachev signed that new treaty and destroyed, almost 3,000 nuclear weapons, he admitted that they were in violation of the ABM treaty and shut down the offending radar system.
Yep. It's absolutely possible to fix problems. I think, to go back to the famous Kennedy line, our problems are man-made. They can be fixed by man. Like, we get ourselves into these treaty fights and we can get ourselves out. You just have to be committed. There has to be political will. There has to be patience. And there has to be an empowering of the technical experts who can go out and sort of move the pieces around into the right places. And that's what's really lacking in the Trump administration, is he's not letting his experts go and be experts, go and get the win for him. When he said publicly that in relation to North Korea, that he was the only one that matters, he just disempowered everybody he was going to send out to negotiate for him. Because he said publicly, I am the only one that matters. That means any decision has to come through him. It's not a good way to negotiate.
Which helps explain why the North Koreans were reluctant to meet with undersecretaries and assistant secretaries and special envoys. What's the point?
Yeah.
I see. Is it your view then that the Trump administration used the Russian violation of the INF treaty as an excuse to kill a treaty they wanted to kill anyway?
I don't think there was unanimity inside the government for this move ahead. I think that's evidenced by the fact that you actually had officials testifying on the Hill saying they didn't really know what came next. They didn't know what the next U.S. move was, how quickly or if we would go and move to deploy our own intermediate range missiles. We still don't know if there's any country that would actually ever host a missile like that.
Either in Europe or in Asia.
Exactly.
But we're going ahead and testing them and developing them?
Yeah, it looks like we're taking a sort of missile defense approach to this, a spiral development field of dreams. If we just build a bunch of Glickums, eventually someone will take them.
Yeah. Ground-launched cruise missiles.
Ground-launched cruise missiles.
Thank you.
And
put a quarter in the acronym jar.
Yeah. It rolls off the tongue. Like so many things in this administration, there doesn't seem to be an overarching plan for what we're doing in reducing nuclear risks. You see the same thing with getting out of the Iran deal against the advice of people inside his own government and our allies. The Trump administration decided to get out of the Iran deal. And, now close to 2 years later, we're in a worse situation. Iran has hardened its position. Our allies are furious with us. And
no better deal.
No better deal.
And no apparent plan. Right? Do you think this is a question of impulses and instinct that is causing us to drift into a less secure world? Or is this a conscious plan of people who want to get rid of these treaties that restrain U.S. military forces because they think that's the world we'd rather live in? Is it intentional or accidental?
It's actually both. I think there are people who have never liked arms control, who've always thought that any constraint on the U.S. system makes us less safe and that we can kind of go it alone. And that's kind of the idea behind America First, that we can just be strongest, have the biggest military, and just, sort of push our way into the security situation that we want. And then there are people who simply aren't watching the store, as it were, that these treaties that we created in the wake of the Cold War to save ourselves from ourselves have been slowly eroding. They have to be constantly tended. You don't just do a treaty, sign it, ratify it, have some big signing ceremony in a room dipped in gold and marble, and then put that treaty on a shelf and you don't have to worry about it. They are constantly creating problems that have to be worked through, that require skilled experts and patient people and lawyers and scientists and diplomats working together to maintain that treaty. So I would say the combination is what's so dangerous now, is we have the neglect that's just built up over the years. We have less staff inside the government working on this. We have less people in the community working on this.
But isn't that less staff intentional? I mean, the current budget slashes the already reduced State Department budget by 30%. 30% cut.
Every single year that the Trump administration has had a chance to roll out a budget, they've come after State Department hardcore, and that's my core question.
So was that neglect or intent?
So it's both. The intent comes from the administration trying to cut state, undervaluing diplomacy. Oh. It's always strange to me at the same time that they say, oh, we're negotiating with Iran and we're negotiating with North Korea, and now we want to negotiate this completely unprecedented trilateral dialogue with the Chinese and the Russians, but we're going to do it completely short-staffed, with one arm tied behind our back and a president who is not going to be paying very close attention. So that's a problem. But there's also a general problem in D.C. of undervaluing State Department. For years now, State Department has had to kind of, raise its hand and say, like, don't forget about us. We need more funds, where DOD just gets effectively a blank check every year. So that's something that both, sides of the political divide are going to have to contend with. If we really want to go out and constrain, various countries in various different ways, just need more diplomatic firepower.
Let me talk to you about a particular initiative by Assistant Secretary Chris Ford that he calls creating the environment for nuclear disarmament. I view this very cynically. I don't think they're serious about it at all. They use the initial CEND for this. I think they should just call it END for End Arms Control as we know it, that it's just an effort to try to have something to say at the NPT review conference. It says, no, we can't do anything yet because we need to change the world politics and establish a federation of planets before we can possibly talk about reductions anymore. But I sense that you're a little more sympathetic to this, and I have to admit, you've actually talked to these people. I have not. So tell me.
I actually think it's a good initiative. If it is an excuse to not do anything on disarmament, to just have something to show up with at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, starts at the end of April, then that's a bad thing. I'd like to think it actually is an acknowledgement that nuclear issues are tied into so many other issues. We don't get to a better place with Russia's aggression towards its neighbors unless we're locking down the most critically dangerous thing, which is their very capable nuclear arsenal. We don't get to peace in the Middle East without working through problems like a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the region, but it's very hard to get to that weapons of mass destruction free zone, process without dealing with some of the underlying conflicts. These things overlap inextricably. Same thing in Asia. There is no sort of path to dealing with North Korean aggression long term. We can lock down the nuclear program, but there's a larger regional conflict that feeds into that we have to deal with. So I'd like to think that the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament initiative is about understanding those connections.
You touch on some of these issues in your forthcoming article in this new edition of the SICE Review of International Affairs called Preparing for the Next 75 Years of the Nuclear Age. And you say that this anniversary, the anniversary of the Trinity test, the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, should be a time for us to take stock and prepare for different policies. So you think the State Department effort could be part of that, but clearly that's not enough. What else do you think we should do?
Not enough at all. We actually have to kind of rethink where we are. I think we've been in a bit of a theoretical rut that simply because we've managed not to ruin the world thus far, that our policies are working and nothing should ever be changed, the status quo should be maintained forever. We're lucky that nothing ever went wrong. In fact, the law of odds is working against us. And the longer we sort of stay here, assuming nothing will ever go wrong, the more likely it is that something will go wrong. And, the more I think about it, it's almost like heretical to say this. We've just been guessing this whole time. There's no empirical evidence for anything. There's only been 2 uses, thank God, of nuclear weapons ever. So everything that we formulated around, how nuclear weapons work and how countries perceive them has been done sort of via theory. And
without any empirical data to
yes,
back it up.
Exactly. But somehow when you question these theories, there's such furious pushback to the kind we can't possibly change that because it's been working. The triad is a good example of that. Thought it was fascinating when Alex Wellerstein, who's a historian up at the Stevens Institute of Technology, did an Ngram search on Google and couldn't find any evidence of the triad, the 3 legs of our nuclear forces, air, sea, and land. The capital T didn't appear until the late 70s, which coincidentally was the same time we had started doing real arms limitations and real arms reduction talks. So all of a sudden, forces start to scramble and you want to institutionalize capital T triad.
Right, because it was also the time when those original weapons were wearing out and it was time to recapitalize the force. Yeah. And suddenly we had to capitalize all 3 legs because this is the triad, like it's the Holy Trinity.
Yeah, but exactly. The concept now is this sort of, almost biblical, sort of religious idea of this, we have to have these 3 legs. That doesn't really, sync with the history of how we got here.
And knowing that history informs what you're doing right now, because here we are again. So those weapons that we started building under President Carter and Reagan in the late 70s and 80s are wearing out. Very few of us drive a 1980s car or have a 1980s TV. So they're wearing out, and it's time to build new ones. And again, we hear the enshrinement, the mythologicalization, is that a word? Of the triad, as if we have to have this, we have to do this. And this brings me to the Council for a Livable World and the Center. Because your view is that this is not just an academic debate. It's not just articles being traded. That one of the things that keeps the nuclear weapons complex going and churning in such a powerful force is the politics on Capitol Hill. And you confront the politics on these issues directly. Tell me how.
So the center is our NGO think tank side of the operation. And we're primarily focused on reducing nuclear weapons arsenals, halting the spread of nuclear weapons, reducing the risk of war. But we orient that by and large at Capitol Hill. Used to be that you couldn't work in a security-related position on the Hill and not have a pretty extensive knowledge of nuclear postures, both here in the United States and worldwide. You might remember from your time on the Hill. It was common. People were conversant in these issues. It's just not the case anymore. And often staff, even if they are interested in or educated about nuclear weapons issues, they usually have 4 and 5 and 6 portfolios that they're managing at the same time. It's a little difficult, particularly with all of the nuclear crises that are going on, to keep up with any one. So we just make ourselves available sort of as a tool, a supplement. We do everything from, individual briefings to setting up lunches, bringing in speakers, both academics, policymakers, government officials, to talk through some of these issues in just an open and nonpartisan space where people can just learn more about nuclear issues, just make it easier for them to, get their arms around what can be very complicated and sort of prohibitively wonky subject matter. Like I said, maintaining the status quo is a kind of common refrain in DC. If it's not broke, don't fix it, or it'll be too hard, people will object. But the nuclear modernization budget, as currently slated, is $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years and growing. We can't afford that. And in fact, many experts, military experts, technical experts have said we can do this, maintain a safe, secure, effective nuclear stockpile for as long as nuclear weapons exist, and do it for less, and do it with a smaller force. And that's what people really need to be looking at on the Hill, and in the academic community. Start questioning some of these assumptions, not because you don't believe in deterrence or you do believe in deterrence, simply because that's good governance.
So how do you see this playing out? What do you think you might be able to achieve, or what are the key issues you'll be working on in this coming budget cycle with the National Defense Authorization Act, and then what do you see following the next year?
What I'd like to see in this budget cycle is more members of Congress and their staff pushing the administration to really justify the line items in their budget. With the low-yield W-76-2 warhead that has already been deployed on our forces, I don't think Congress ever really got a real set of answers about concerns about, does this make our subs vulnerable? What are the targets?
Right.
How come we have 1,000 low-yield warheads in our arsenal, and you've asked us to recapitalize the delivery platforms for those low-yield weapons, but somehow they're not viable against Russian air defenses? These are the kind of questions that need to be asked. And I think sometimes there's a reticence to ask it because it seems reasonable, and you've got, somebody with stars on their shoulders who's saying, we need this, but that
It's
military is
surprisingly hard for members to say no to generals, which is why they get trotted up there all the time, including retired generals who now work for the defense contractors they used to oversee. Yeah.
But the thing is, those administration officials are administration officials. This is the White House's policy that the government is enacting. They are not independent lobbyists. They are not giving you unbiased information. The administration put together a nuclear posture review in 2018. The warheads, the delivery systems they're pushing for are a product of that document. That document is a White House document. It wasn't formed independently by any administration official who's coming up to testify. So the Congress is within their rights to really dig down. Do we absolutely need these systems?
A lot of our listeners are young and are just starting off in the field, and I was wondering if you could share with us how you ended up where you are today. And I admit I have some personal knowledge of this. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started and some of the problems and obstacles you faced and overcame?
I always think it's an interesting question when I get it, because it's not like I was 5 years old and thought, I want to be a nuclear weapons expert. Actually, at 5, I think I wanted to be the president, and then that shortly changed to zoologist. I was always interested in international affairs and politics, and that was very much encouraged by my parents. I grew up in rural Western North Carolina. When I go back there, most people think I'm a spy, and I'm like, oh, no, it's nothing like that. And I try to explain how nuclear weapons policy works, and they're like, so yeah, you're a spy. And I'm like, just let that one go generally. But I'm quite confident that I am Tuxedo, North Carolina's only nuclear weapons expert, probably. And that came about. I went to Carolina, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for undergrad, and did war studies there. And then immediately following that, I went to the Peace Corps. 9/11 happened shortly after I started my service, and then was there through the start of the Iraq War. And obviously the Iraq War bringing a lot of WMD issues to light that kind of, piqued my interest a little bit in graduate school. I kind of spent equal amounts of time on Israel-Palestine conflict issues in graduate school, and then also bioweapons. And I think I made the less depressing life choice by going into weapons of mass destruction work. I hope that's not always the case. But so I ended up down here after grad school. And
that's where we met.
That's where we met. You decided to hire me despite my complete fixation on bioweapons, which I know you think are so unimportant. And Not nearly as cool as nuclear weapons.
A tertiary threat. We started at the Center for American Progress when I was still vice president there.
Exactly. We were at CAP, and then we came over to Plowshares.
You helped me open up the Washington office
At one point,
over 12 years ago.
My desk at the brand new DC Plowshares office was in the kitchen galley, and my computer was on the kitchen counter, and my legs went into a cupboard and I sat at a stool. So Plowshares has come a long way.
We still have some of this furniture you helped us buy. You all, you, me, Terry Lodge, and Tony Wilson, and you all went on to much more important jobs. Terry over to the State Department. Tony Wilson, I think, is still up at Open Society Foundation in New York. Mm-hmm. You followed Terry into the State Department, and now you're the senior policy director. What was it like at State Department?
State Department is amazing. The people there do unbelievable work and do it quietly and without a lot of accolades and just dealing with the hardest problems in the world and just keep coming to work. So
I always think of Jim Timby as the model State Department expert.
Jim Timby is absolutely brilliant, but also very quiet and unassuming. And any time he ever came back, say from Iran deal negotiations, and wanted to tell any of us, it was like we were little kids, like circling up and sitting down like crisscross applesauce, like waiting for him to tell us a story, because there's nobody.
And he never claimed credit for anything. I don't know what that's like.
Yeah, there's nobody who knew more about the ins and outs of the last 50 years.
And the State Department is
control.
Filled with people like that.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
So it's any advice for people who are just starting off on their career? Are there particular problems you encountered as a young person trying to make it, as a woman trying to make it in this field?
At times it's hard in this field to be a woman still, despite a large amount of amazing women who've achieved so much, like Rose Gottemuller and Wendy Sherman and Laura Holgate. There's still issues that women deal with, sitting around a conference table and saying something and no one really paying attention. And then 2 minutes later, a man says it and everyone's like, oh, that's a great idea. And I'm like, is this still happening? But you just have to push through, I guess, and find a support group. The women in this field actually are quite good at supporting each other, and there are a lot of male allies who support them as well. I don't know about other parts of the national security field, but I do think the nuclear policy field is really working to make more opportunities for both women and people from diverse backgrounds, people of color, and we just have to continue pushing it. I've been asked before, how did I get in? And I tell people I've really never met somebody who didn't want to be in this field, really wanted to be in this field, was committed to working on arms control, non-proliferation, nuclear policy, that didn't find a way in. Because, it is a very distinctive field. It will break your heart at times. If you are really interested in being in this field, I find that people find a way in. But it's patience, it's persistence, it's running that fine line between persistent and annoying, which is a hard line to get to sometimes. We need more young people in the field. We need to make it easier for them to get in the field. We need to make it easier for them to stay in the field. And we also need to open up the conversation a bit to let people challenge these assumptions that have kind of run nuclear policy for the last 75 years. The world is different now. The challenges we're facing are larger, and we're not going to do it if we make everybody think the same way that everyone's thought before. So I regularly encourage the people that work with me to push harder, to not just accept that this is the way it is, and I hope that other people in the field do it as well.
That's a wonderful place to end. There are many more questions I have, but we'll have to have you back. Alexandra Bell, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm. sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.